We are now live. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our most recent Civically Speaking episode. Civically Speaking is A.R.T's virtual series featuring conversations, lectures, and performance events on various topics, ranging from history, politics, justice, and the meaning of democracy. And today I am so pleased to be joined by Dr. Ramie Targoff of Brandeis University, who I'll invite to join me on screen in just a few minutes for our discussion of the three witches of Macbeth in their historical context. I am Sarah Schofield-Manser. I am A.R.T's Assistant Director of Special Events and Partnerships. I use the she series of pronouns. I am a white woman with dark brown hair wearing a black shirt. I tried to be festive for the mood today, and I'm sitting in a new space. For those of you who watch our virtual events, I am in a different area that I normally am. So welcome to my new virtual episode setup. It's very exciting, comfortable. Lighting's not ideal, but we're here and we're going to make it work. I want to acknowledge that the land that the Loeb Drama Center and Oberon occupy is the unceded territory of the indigenous Massachusetts people, and that I myself am also calling in from the land of the Massachusetts people today. I'd also like to encourage you to explore the indigenous land that you might be calling in from today, and I am going to put a link in the chat for you to discover a little bit more. That having been said, I also want to read A.R.T's anti-racism commitment statement. The A.R.T is unequivocally opposed to hate, and we center anti-racism as a core value. And we expect everyone in the A.R.T community, including our audiences, to uphold these values. And as such, we will not tolerate anti-Blackness or racism of any kind in our buildings, nor at our online events. We aim to create an environment that is uninhabitable to racism and to discrimination, where all BIPOC staff, artists, volunteers, audience, and community members are seen, heard, valued, and given the opportunity to thrive. This work is only possible when we do it together. So thank you for being our partner in it. Very excited to be here today. Before we go into our conversation, I do want to offer some additional details about the production to which we are tying into today. And that is, of course, Macbeth In Stride, which is created by award-winning artist Whitney White. The show uses an original pop, rock, gospel, and R&B score to explore Black female power, femininity, and ambition. Very exciting news. The show opens tomorrow, October 28th, and it will run through November 14th at the Loeb Drama Center. You can learn more at AmericanRepertoryTheater.org, and I will drop a link in the chat in just a few minutes. Wonderful. So without further ado, I would love to invite our fantastic guest for today, Dr. Ramie Targoff, to join me on screen. Hi, Ramie.
Hi, Sarah.
How are you doing?
Good. Hi, everybody.
Amazing. Do you want to give a little self-introduction while I put a link in the chat for Macbeth In Stride for me?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Ramie Targoff, as you've heard already, a professor of English and Italian Studies at Brandeis. I'm actually right now sitting in my colleague, Professor Emma Smith's office in Hertford College at Oxford. I'm across the street. I can see out my window the Bodleian Library. And so I'm here as a visiting scholar this semester at Oxford, and I have very poor Wi-Fi where I'm living, so I'm borrowing this lovely office, which has the advantage of many, many volumes of Shakespeare, which I could show you, but I'm angling this so you can see me. So it's lovely to be here, and I'm ready for our conversation when you are, Sarah.
That's fantastic. So happy to see you, and great that we're both in spaces that are a little bit new to us. It kind of gives a difference to the conversation. So without further ado, just launching right in. And I do want to note for everyone watching, we're going to reserve about 20 minutes at the end of the hour for audience Q&A. So if you have questions at any time for Ramie, please submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We want to answer as many as possible, so submit those at any point and we'll get to them at the end of the hour. Without further ado, I'd love to unpack the larger historical context of Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth for everyone at home, not Macbeth In Stride, the production of the Loeb, but unpacking the larger historical context of Macbeth in relation to the witches. Was there any urgency to the question of witches and witchcraft when Shakespeare wrote the play? Why did he write these characters?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it has a really rich and complicated answer. I'll try to make it simple, and we can dig deeper as we like. So in 1603, King James became King James of Scotland. James VI of Scotland became King of England. And one of the many things he brought with him into his new realm was an obsession with witchcraft. He was singularly obsessed with witches. He believed strongly in their power. In the early 1590s, I think it was 1590 or 1591, on his way back from Denmark, where he had picked up his queen, Anne of Denmark, there was a horrible storm that seemed to affect his ship in particular that was basically shipwrecked. And he actually blamed it on witches. He genuinely believed that witches were responsible. There was a very sensational pamphlet published called News from Scotland that people in England would have seen as well, that described the intervention of the witches. And James, the King of Scotland, participated in a witchcraft trial. He oversaw the trial of 3 witches. The number 3 is a magical one that we'll come back to, but one in particular, a woman named Agnes Sampson, who actually claimed that she had traveled in a kitchen sieve, so like a strainer for your pasta or whatever it would have been.
Interesting.
To, a couple hundred miles with 200 other witches to take orders from the devil to poison or kill James. So anyway, the point is, this sounds crazy to us, but James really believed in it. So when James came to England in 1603, the status of witchcraft anxiety rose high. That's not to say it wasn't already at a pretty high pitch before James got there, but it became much more urgent. And actually, since I'm sitting here at Oxford, I should just add that James made a visit to Oxford in 1605. So Macbeth was probably written around 1605, 1606. The year before Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, James made a visit to Oxford. And when monarchs in the Renaissance, one of the reasons we have such fabulous theater from this period is when monarchs came to visit, people would put on plays for them. That's what they did. They put on entertainments. So the welcome event for King James at Oxford a year before Shakespeare wrote Macbeth was this little play and entertainment that began with 3 witches or 3 sibyls. These were boys dressed as ancient prophetesses who come out from a wood. So there's a lot of Macbeth stuff here. Come out from a wood, and they address James as Banquo's relative, as Banquo as his ancestor, as his descendant, and they say, "Hail, hail, King of England, Scotland," and so forth. So a lot of the language that we see at the beginning of Macbeth actually has a weird resonance with this, more like a skit than a play that was performed for James. But the big picture is that everyone knew that James was really interested in, if not obsessed with witchcraft. He actually wrote his own treatise about witchcraft called The Demonology in 1597, in which he refuted the idea that this was all kind of a fantasy. There had been a previous book by Reginald Scott called The Discovery of Witchcraft, which discovery meaning like revealing of the fraud that is witchcraft. So Reginald Scott was a skeptic, and James took him apart, just wrote a long treatise, like quoting Reginald Scott and then disputing it. So James was a very adamant believer.
Interesting. And I don't want to go too off topic, but I do have to ask, do we have any sense of why he was so adamant in his belief of witches and witchcraft? I obviously the historical context and the religious context of the day, but it doesn't sound like that was necessarily the norm. So I'm curious on why he was so vehement about that position.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Sarah. Scotland in particular was in the grip of a witchcraft frenzy. It was stronger in Scotland than it was in England. James's mother, remember, was Mary Queen of Scots, who was constantly referred to. In fact, when she died, people were apparently shouting, "Kill the witch." So, his mother had been accused of being a witch. There was a lot of sort of hysteria about witches in Scotland. We'd probably have to have a whole other session on what was going on for James. But needless to say, he was interested in the topic. I do want to just add, it wasn't the case, as I said before, that England wasn't obsessed with this topic too. And as early as 1542, so long before Elizabeth or James came to the throne, England passed its first, Parliament passed its first law making any act of witchcraft a felony. So, there's a long history of this in England. It wasn't a new development.
I find this all so beyond fascinating. So thank you for giving us
Super interesting.
It's so interesting. So turning a little bit of our attention to the character of the witches in Macbeth, who are the witches in Macbeth? And looking at them as characters, how did they either combat or reify some of these common contemporary conceptions of witches at the time?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating thing to think about. One important thing to say is that Shakespeare chooses to begin the play, as we know, with the witches. And the potential argument that the witches are just figments of Macbeth's or Macbeth and Banquo's imagination is pretty much refuted by the fact that they're reified. We see them before we see Macbeth. The very first line of the play is incredibly fascinating. When shall we three meet again? When shall we three meet again? So they're recognized as real, and that's actually an incredibly important thing that Shakespeare is sort of affirming his king's belief, right, that witches exist. But the question of who these women are, if they're women at all, what they are, is not just a question you and I are asking or audience says, it's what Macbeth and Banquo are asking. So what's really interesting is that when Macbeth and Banquo see these three figures, they can't figure out who or what they're seeing. And in fact, it's interesting that Banquo, when he looks at them, he says, what are these, right? What are these? Actually, I should emphasize that these, because Macbeth turns it from the third person to the second person. And Macbeth says, what are you? Okay. So all of a sudden, Macbeth is able to talk to them directly. What are you? And their answer to that is, all hail Macbeth, which gives me practically the shivers just thinking about it. What are you? All hail Macbeth. That's not really an answer, but it links these people together. So in terms of their status as witches per se, these aren't really the most ordinary witches. Most witches in England and Scotland, and we have a lot of information because of all the legal trials about them, shared certain qualities. Were women, were older usually, and were poor. Poverty is actually probably the single biggest defining feature of witches in this period, besides being women. So it's interesting that Banquo is trying to figure out, he says, are you women, but you have beards. So their gender is very confusing to Macbeth and Banquo. So they don't look entirely typical. But when they talk about what they're doing, what they're up to, then they actually hit a lot of the sort of common things that witches did. And one really interesting thing is that if you compare witchcraft trials in England and Scotland on the one hand with continental witchcraft trials on the other, continental witchcraft trials in France and Italy and Germany were mostly organized around the idea of devils, Sabbaths, of pacts with the devil, of witches gathering at night together and performing kind of demonic acts. Witches in England were much more sort of dealing with pettier, more local crimes. So it wasn't a theological crime in England. On the continent, it was it was belief in the devil, that you'd sold your soul to the devil. The devil didn't really enter into English minds until quite a bit later. So what these witches seem to be doing in Macbeth, they're interfering with the weather, which is something which is in England. The weather here, I must say, I understand how one could think about that. But, the idea that James thought the witches caused his shipwreck by creating all these storms, that's very typical. And the witches of Macbeth fit that. They're using familiars. So they're little daemons to do their harm. And that's one of the most insidious things about persecuting witches, is that witchcraft is an impossible crime to persecute because you can't observe it. So if I'm sitting at home, but I've sent my dog or cat or a bat out to poison your mother's, cow, how do you trace that back to me, right? So anyway, the witches in Macbeth are using familiars. It's very rarely a witch physically performing a crime. It's almost always done through either a spell or a chant or a familiar. So they're interfering with weather, they're using familiars to cause harm to people, and they're prophesizing. And that's something that that obviously is incredibly important to the play, that they're speaking prophecies. But that's actually less typical, the prophecy, than the other things I've just said.
This is so interesting. And a question, full disclosure for people in the audience, I find this topic super fascinating, and I'm a big history nerd, so I've done a little research of my own. But thinking about when witches, not the witches of Macbeth, but witches in the contemporary Scottish or English or even American sense, were accused of committing these crimes, in the overall scheme of things, if you think about someone who might have power to influence the elements or the surroundings around them, accusing them or thinking of them as doing things that I would consider to be relatively petty, poisoning a neighbor's cow, maybe blighting some crops locally, when they could really wreak havoc on a much larger scale. Yeah. Give a little more insight into sort of what the thinking was surrounding these accusations of you could say it far better than I.
Yeah, no, it's there's a great book by a wonderful historian named Keith Thomas from 50 years ago called Religion and the Decline of Magic. And he talks about how English witchcraft was really a way to deal with the kind of minor problems in people's lives. The larger scale problems that were far out of the realm of agency of a single woman, or were referred to God, were referred to the divine, but crops failing, livestock being ill, roofs falling in accidentally, these things that seem to have no explanation tended to be blamed on the poorest, the least sort of adjusted people in society. So the witch was your sort of go-to scapegoat for lots of things that went wrong. And when there was more economic unrest, you see an uptick in witchcraft accusations. They were also, on a more serious, these are serious things, but on a more serious note, they were often involved with fertility issues and with death of children. That's something that witches were very often accused of. And I did some work with the Scottish Witchcraft Archive last year when I was teaching a witchcraft class. And I was really struck by the fact that one of the largest categories of witches in Scotland were midwives. Women accused of being witches were midwives. So that's an incredibly powerful position. You're delivering babies, and that's threatening. And anything that goes wrong with that birth is potentially could lead to your death, basically.
That's I've never thought about it like that, but that's so interesting. It's just always been a question at the back of my mind. If you think this person can do anything,
right? Why are they doing? Why aren't they doing
that?
Major things, yeah.
Right, exactly.
But witches were 95% women. There were some men accused of being witches, and they weren't given that much room, as it were, in the imaginative world of late 16th and 17th century England, to cause wars or to have sort of major upheaval. It was much more local and kind of at the level of the village, of your local community.
Makes sense. So interesting. So we've walked through a little bit of the historical context and sort of the characterization of the witches themselves, turning our attention now to the broader plot of Macbeth and looking holistically at the plot. How much can be explained through the lens of the witches or through their actions that we see in the play?
Yeah, this is, as I'm sure a huge question. And depending on how one stages the play and how one wants to think about it, the answer will vary. But the witches obviously launch the play. The play begins with the witches. They plant the idea through their prophecy in Macbeth's head. And after that, their interventions are minimal. So, once we get through the opening scene, the first act of the play, the witches start to fade as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth become more interesting. So if you want to read the play psychologically, which is a very compelling way to read this play, the witches have a small role. But obviously the question which Macbeth and Banquo ask about, what are the sort of metaphysical stakes of this? How much is this being plotted by the witches? It's never fully resolved. And so I think that's what makes the play so interesting, that we're constantly weighing how much of this is a set of really bad human decisions and how much of this was going to happen inevitably. And that, that also depends on how you want to think about Lady Macbeth, because the play very clearly shifts from the witches sort of spurring Macbeth on to his wife spurring him on. And her own status is really unclear, because on the one hand, we imagine her, she's very often represented as a very sexy, feminine femme fatale who is nothing like these women that we meet at the beginning. On the other hand, she, makes this terrifying speech in which she basically conjures up evil spirits to unsex her and to substitute her maternal milk for gall. So, is Lady Macbeth a witch? How many witches are in this play? Is it 3? Is it 4? Are there other witches? But I would say, just in terms of the bigger question you ask, if we take the witches out, the play loses a lot of its kind of creepy magic, not just because they're so interesting, but because the question of whether Macbeth could ever get out from this prophecy is always hovering over us. So on the one hand, he thinks he has the capacity to change his mind, for example, but we see he never changes his mind, right? He just gets darker and darker into this.
I'm glad you asked that question, because this sort of leads me to my next topic. And this ties back to a conversation we had in April of 2020 with you and your husband, Stephen Greenblatt, and Whitney White, the creator of Macbeth In Stride. But if Lady Macbeth is a witch, what does that mean for her as a character? And what does it mean for the play overall?
Yeah. Well, so I think if she were a straightforward witch, it would be a lot less interesting. She's she's not a witch. But is she trying to conjure up evil spirits and in effect behave like a witch? Yeah, she is. And so that's interesting. So the question is, how much, when women think about gaining some kind of power and agency, how much is that the temptation? I don't mean necessarily ordinary citizens, but when Shakespeare is trying to think about what it would mean for her to embolden herself to do this, horrific deed. He does use the language of witchcraft, that she's actually, asks to be sort of stripped of her humanness and turned into something supernatural. So you can see the terror of the witch as sort of the most threatening form of womanhood, even though she's, as I say, asking to be unsexed. She is actively conjuring spirits. And the idea of conjuring spirits is actually very different from the sort of local village witch who's, poisoning, your milk because you didn't pay her for the wool that you spun last week. That's what most witchcraft accusations look like. But the conjuring up of evil spirits is actually more of what I'm calling the continental version of witchcraft, because it has to do with the devil and with making some kind of covenant with the devil. And interestingly, in 1604, so a year or two before Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, for the first time in English parliamentary law, they passed a new statute against witchcraft, against the practice of witchcraft. So there were basically 3 laws passed in the 16th to early 17th century about witchcraft. In 1542 and 1563, there were laws passed that forbade any evil spirits to be conjured for any purpose, even for nice purposes. So conjuring spirits was bad. But in 1604, they specifically passed legislation about making compacts with the devil, with actually conjuring up the devil. And so that is a sign that all of the horrendous witchcraft trials going on the continent, which were run by the church, by the Inquisition, had sort of seeped in. So it's interesting. I like to think that Shakespeare was kind of throwing some of that in, that Lady Macbeth was actually like violating recent English law, like the year before this law had been passed.
He was really up to date.
I don't know, but
but hey, I would trust him to be. So deviating a little bit, we've been talking a lot about some of the evidence that's been gleaned through legal trials, different laws that were passed. The natural question that I'm sure a lot of our audience is thinking about, and that I'm certainly thinking about, the sexy topic of the witchcraft trials in England, Scotland, and then of course later, but in the United States. Can we talk a little bit about the evidence and the way that we study those, and a little bit about how those were orchestrated and perhaps orchestrated differently from one another?
Yeah, sure. So one of the amazing sources for all this material comes from legal transcripts, that we actually have lots and lots of documents that include women's voices, giving testimony. We always need to remember that these women were giving testimony after having been accused of witchcraft, facing death. So, the veracity of their statements need to be taken with a grain of salt. But really, the wave of witchcraft trials in England and Scotland in the starting really, there were some early, but the really intense period was in the 1580s to the early 1600s. And for those trials, very often we have both the court records, but then we have a bunch of more sensational materials that were written about these trials in England. So, the true and horrendous story of, Edith Brommer, witch of, different communities who would have these witchcraft trials, and people just love to read about this. Just as we're fascinated by it, they were as well. So one interesting example is that there was a play written by a group of Shakespeare's contemporaries. We're not sure who had a larger hand in it, but Dekker and others, called The Witch of Edmonton. And that play was written around 1621. And that's about an old lady who, through the use of her dog, has been accused of murdering and doing all sorts of things. And that was pretty much, the material for that was pretty much based on the transcript of her trial, and then this sort of broadsheet, this cheap pamphlet that was published that people were reading. So the point of this is to say, this wasn't sort of locked up in the courthouses, that people were making money off of these trials. And so we have tons of documents, but they're often kind of sensationalized, sort of propagandized, that people were really focused on this. Very often the trials of witches were involved more than one witch. So that it's not, as said before, that James oversaw a trial of 3 witches, that women were accused of working together, or just multiple accusations would come up. And so that's a sort of interesting moment where the power of the groups of women seemed more threatening, the idea that they were together. When you get to the sort of continental version of this, it's often larger groups who were accused, as I said before, of meeting at midnight in a circle to conjure the devil, to do something horrible. And actually, that model is more like the Salem model in a way, that the idea that this thing was spreading like wildfire through a community. We start to see that in France at some convents where it's like plague, like an outbreak of witchcraft, that all the nuns are possessed all of a sudden, and they're possessed by the devil. But the English-Scottish version that Shakespeare would have been familiar with had much less to do with possession. Possession really wasn't a big topic. It was much more what's called maleficium, like just evil deed. So the maleficia, all the evil things that you could do, but didn't have theological stakes.
This is such an incredible distinction, especially for someone whose primary background in this topic is embedded in Salem, which feels like a completely different beast.
Yes.
A little bit on this last question we were discussing, but I'm wondering, we've talked about the witches in Macbeth, and you just discussed this play that had been written, but were there other contemporary depictions of witches specifically written for the stage? And if so, how did they differ from Shakespeare's representation of the witches in Macbeth?
Yeah, it was a pretty popular topic, but not tremendously popular compared to, let's say, Cleopatra, about whom there were, 4 plays written during this period. There weren't that many witchcraft, many plays that dealt with witchcraft, but there were a few. So I mentioned The Witch of Edmonton, which was a little bit later, 1621. Sometime around 1613 to 15, Thomas Middleton, who is responsible for the songs and possibly for the witch's reappearance later in Macbeth. That's a topic that is probably not of as much interest, but we're not sure that Shakespeare wrote the later bits in the play of, so maybe that is interesting, involving the witches. But the songs in particular that the witches sing come from, and the Hecate material is actually lifted from, shows up in the folio in Shakespeare's folio in 1623, but it's lifted from Thomas Middleton's play called The Witch. And the figure of Hecate, who's, shows up here too, is the evil witch who's making a compact with the devil and who's working on behalf of a woman, I think her name is Rosamond, who wants to poison her husband. And so it's much more sort of hiring, the hitman to do the work that you need done. But so there was Middleton's The Witch. There was a really interesting masque. So masks were court performances done usually for royal audiences and their guests. And usually only performed once. There was a really interesting masque written by Ben Jonson in 1609 called The Masque of Queens. And the stars of that masque were Queen Anne and 11 of her sort of most aristocratic, ladies of her privy chamber and so forth, each of whom got dressed up like a historical queen. So queens of the Amazon, of ancient Egypt, and so on. But so they were all parading around in their queen outfits. And interestingly, Queen Anne, James's wife, who was also interested in witches, asked Ben Jonson to write a foil, an anti-mask that would be performed before the queens came on stage. And so we don't know if Anne asked for this particular anti-mask or Jonson just thought it'd be appropriate. But what Jonson did was have 12 witches come on stage. And he calls them hags or witches. They're described wearing costumes that have rats on their shoulders or heads. They're carrying poison. And each of the 12 women comes on stage and recites a little spell, a kind of charm. And then they're chased off stage, literally, by the 12 good women, by the aristocratic women. But what's interesting about that, Sarah, is that I like to think that Anne chose them to be witches because you can see that the most threatening form of female power to the queen would have been the witch, that they would be set against each other. So anyway, so there are these other sort of, a few plays, this masque, but as I say, it wasn't showing up all the time. It was, every couple of years we see a play.
Oh, I would give anything to see that masque performed back in. If anyone out there has a time machine or a way to bring that to fruition, you email me and we will talk. We are going to turn our attention to the Q&A in about 7 minutes, but I do want to lift up a question that has already been submitted because it directly ties to what we were just talking about. So someone in the audience is bringing up the fact that throughout Act 1, as we've said, there are 3 witches, and then Hecate is added in Act 3 and the beginning of Act 4. As you've mentioned, this person is suggesting that many folks have suggested that this Hecate scene in Act 3 was not authored by Shakespeare at all and added after his death. Can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on this? Not to put you on the spot, but I'm very curious. I never heard of this before. This is brand new to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for this theory. I think the argument was initially made because the play seems weaker at that moment. And so it was a kind of argument about Shakespeare. At least that's one argument that was made. But in fact, because the songs, so Hecate isn't in the opening scene, because Hecate, the character is coming out of Middleton's play, the songs that we find in Middleton's play show up in this text. And all this shows up in the 1623 folio when Shakespeare is dead. There's really no basis to think this was part of the original text. And I say original because with Shakespeare's text, as I'm sure many of our listeners know, Shakespeare didn't hand over an official version of his plays the way Ben Jonson did. We don't really know. But the witches, the interest of the witches is so much less in the middle of this play. They've done their bit at the beginning. And so this feels like a kind of entertainment and less like something that's essential to what is fascinating about the plot. You know, I don't think that we can know for sure, but I'm sympathetic and tend to teach that part as probably not written by Shakespeare. And I think it's also just important to say that, you know, Shakespeare's collaborations were far beyond what we, you know, imagined before. I mean, that we know with many of his later plays that there were other people involved in them. So our sort of obsessive idea of Shakespeare as this sort of genius author needs to be always checked. But in this case, we literally have material from another play that shows up in this play. So it seems pretty clear. Shakespeare might have been collaborating with Middleton. That is also possible. But I'm pretty, I don't want to say convinced, but it's persuasive to me.
I would agree. That's so, I cannot believe that I've never heard this theory before. I clearly need to do a little more homework on Shakespeare myself. I have a final question for you, not a final, because we've got some active questions in the Q&A that are excellent, but throughout the text of Macbeth, I feel that the witches and Lady Macbeth they're sort of cast as villains in a lot of ways. They are not overtly sympathetic characters in many regards. Do you feel any sympathy for Lady Macbeth, for the witches? Like, what feelings do they elicit in you as not just a scholar, but as a consumer of this play?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that the witches don't have a lot. There's not a lot to love about the witches of Shakespeare's Macbeth. So nor do I think he's interested in them as complicated characters, you know. But Lady Macbeth is a more interesting question. And when Whitney and I had this conversation a couple of years ago, and our audience, I'm sure, will be seeing the play soon and can judge for themselves. You know, she sees Lady Macbeth as a, you know, utterly, I don't want to say utterly sympathetic, but as someone who really deserves our sympathy in lots of ways. And that actually affected a bit when I was teaching the play again last year, how I was thinking about her. I wouldn't say that I have a lot of sympathy for Lady Macbeth, but I do think she's stuck in a way that so many women in the period were stuck with, you know, an impossibly limited life ahead of herself. So, you know, if you think about someone like Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, who has lots to sympathize with, who sees her cousin hero, you know, completely maligned and slandered, and she's incredibly angry and can't do anything. And she says, you know, if I were a man, right, I'd, you know, she explodes in anger. And so you can sort of, if we wanted to, sympathize with Lady Macbeth to the extent that, you know, her hands are tied, basically. I mean, short of what she goes on to do, she can't rise in the society. She has no agency outside of her manipulation of her husband. I don't think Shakespeare goes out of his way to make us sympathize with Lady Macbeth. When we think of villains with whom we could sympathize, she's not one of them. In other words, Claudius in Hamlet is given this incredibly complicated, in some ways moving soliloquy where he says, you know, I'm trying to pray and I can't. I wish I could repent, but does that mean I have to give up my crown and my queen? You know, Shakespeare hands the play over to his villain and asks us to kind of enter into his dilemma. And however much we agree or disagree with him, you can see Shakespeare as a playwright doing something quite extraordinary. I don't think any of Lady Macbeth's soliloquies or speeches does anything like that. I don't think that we're meant to sympathize with her. I think she's much more like Regan and Goneril in King Lear, that Shakespeare's pushing the limits of human evilness. And that's why it's important she's not a witch, that, as he discovers in King Lear as Lear discovers with Regan and Goneril, that they're actually human beings. They're not, we can't blame this on the supernatural. And I think that is also the case here. Given her psychological breakdown at the end of the play too, we see that she is super vulnerable and that there are consequences. Again, that I don't think is meant to pull at our heartstrings, but just to show that she's actually not someone removed from a moral compass. In other words, there are consequences emotionally, psychologically for her.
Right. That scene is so powerful, but I do not find it particularly compelling towards sympathetic for her as a character. This is amazing timing. We are at a little past 1:40, so I would love to turn our attention to the Q&A. Very quickly, we do have someone asking if we can discuss the way that Whitney conceives of and makes use of the three witches in Macbeth and how it differs from Shakespeare. I'm going to leave that to Whitney because neither of us are really on the creative team for Macbeth In Stride, unfortunately. However, the conversation that Ramie and I have been referencing that took place last year discusses this a little bit more. And I am right now dropping a YouTube link if you'd like to watch that later on and get a little bit more of an answer to that question. It is now in the chat. So again, feel free to submit any questions you have for us. We're going to answer as many as we can in the next 20 minutes, and it's already pretty well populated. So I would encourage you to submit soon if you have not already done so. So Ramie, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but this person is specifically asking if we can discuss a little bit more of the physical qualities that would have been associated with witchcraft in the day of James I, or were they sound like they were likely female and maybe older, possibly unattractive? How would you physically identify a witch in that time?
So there's no single formula for this, but the predominant physical characteristics of witches were that women were old. There were some young witches as well, and we see in Salem that that's not the case. But speaking now about Scotland and England, they were old. They were either widowed or had never been married. So we don't very often, and that is interesting. We see fewer married witches. So they're kind of on their own. Older women. As I said before, really their single biggest demographic characteristic was poverty. Poverty was just how they were defined as poor women. When they do physical examinations on women, which they start to do in this period to see, looking for signs of witches. They're looking for calls, or extra nipples and things where they would have been sucked by their incubus. So women who have physical deformities actually are more likely to be accused of witchcraft. Also women who were crooked, bent over, didn't stand erect. Those women, that could go with being old, that could go with being poor. But it's very rare in the Scottish and English trials that I've seen that you see young, buxom, sort of healthy women. I would venture to say, I don't have the evidence for this, that most of the witches are post-menopause. I mean, I think that the fertility of younger women is less compatible with the witches. I think they're very often described as shriveled up, as their skin comes up a lot, not their skin color. There's very little racial language here. And that, that's not to say there aren't any women who are described as having darker skin, and there are, but it's not the case that fairness versus darkness is a big distinction. So when Banquo looks at them and describes them as being, having shriveled fingers, as having beards, facial hair, all of that is rather typical.
This is great. And this is feeding into a couple other questions we had in the Q&A. Someone was asking, if the witches were indeed female, why did Shakespeare add beards? But it sounds like that was not out of the possibility. And then because this event is simply bringing all of my favorite historical topics into 1 hour-long conversation, we have a question about Anne Boleyn, one of my favorite historical figures. This person is saying, wasn't Anne Boleyn accused of witchcraft as well as adultery? And did she not have a 6th finger or something of that sort? And she was young and attractive, but a threat to a powerful man. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit? I know it's completely out of the realm of this conversation.
Yeah, so I think it's a very good point and a good question. And I mentioned before that Mary, Queen of Scots, King James's mother, was consistently accused of witchcraft. And basically, when you wanted to hit someone hard, a woman hard, you accused her of being a witch. I mean, that was the surest way, to kind of make sure something terrible was going to happen to this person. So yes, Anne Boleyn was accused of being a witch by multiple sources. I mean, that's something that haunted her. And whoever asked the question is absolutely right. She was young and beautiful, but she was by no means an ordinary victim of a witchcraft accusation. She was a seductress. She was sleeping with, it seems, multiple people. Her charms were sort of mysteriously powerful. And so she was therefore prone to this kind of accusation. But that's very rare. I mean, that's not the common or even frequent in any setting witchcraft accusation. So I would put that in a special category of sort of really powerful royal women whom someone wanted to bring down. Then you do see it, and there are other examples of it as well. But there's not a category of people like Anne Boleyn who were moving around English Scottish society who were being accused of witches.
That makes complete sense. Also to add that I think, to my knowledge, there were no contemporary references to Anne Boleyn having a 6th finger or any sort of...
Right. Yeah, the 6th finger. Yeah. I don't know where that came up, but I don't think that's been verified at all.
I don't think so. I think it shows up in a Spanish account from 100 years later, and there's some obvious reasons why perhaps the Spanish royal court would want to defame her character given everything that happened before her. But this is not a conversation about Henry VIII's lives as much as
that takes us back to our conversation about six.
It does, exactly, which, it was also fascinating. Moving along, so why 3 witches? The number 3 has great significance in the Western tradition. Was that a random numerical determination, or did Shakespeare mean something by creating this trifecta?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think that it might not be the most fascinating way to come at this question, but I think the most likely answer is that Shakespeare was playing with this earlier play from the year before where the 3 Sibyls appeared. But then you can say, well, why did the 3 Sibyls appear in that as well? So, there's lots of things involving witchcraft accusations have to do with the perversion or inversion of Christian tropes and Christian practices. So, so the Trinity is obviously the holiest group of 3. And then, we have, demonic groups of 3 to match them. 3 has a kind of magical power as a number, but there's, I'd be going into numerology, which I'm not expert in. There's no real reason. The only other thing to say is that the sort of choral function, I mean, that they create a kind of polyphonous voice. The idea of having multiple witches, I think, intensifies what Banquo and Macbeth find frightening about them, as opposed to having one of them. They outnumber Macbeth and Banquo also, so there are these 3 figures there. But I'm not sure.
Great, thank you. So many interesting questions. My interest is deeply piqued by this question. So it seems clear that Shakespeare was aware of a lot of, contemporary happenings and obviously dominant thoughts surrounding the topic of witches and witchcraft. But looking at this source material for this particular play, for Macbeth, do we think that he had knowledge of the Oresteia, Aeschylus's trio of Greek plays surrounding the murder of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra, and sort of the mythical setting that happens in there?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of what maybe it sounds like you have a better sense of what's the connection that we're thinking about there.
A very similar plot. So in this trilogy of plays, insofar as surviving, Agamemnon, the king, is murdered by his wife Clytemnestra, and she's sort of visited by these oracle spirits who might be interpreted as witches. So, I can't say that I've read them recently, and I certainly haven't read them in the original Greek, but it does seem similar. And I don't know if there have been any research.
I mean, but it's so different. The killing of Agamemnon by Clytemnestra and her lover is so it feels to me very different from this couple scheming to kill their king to give, I mean, I'm sure there are parallels there, but I think the important thing to say is that this play is based on English chronicles, on Scottish history. In other words, it's not a history play in the strict sense, of course, but really, I think a more interesting thing would be to say, how is this play legitimizing James's rule? How is this playing a way like the Aeneid was for Augustus, of tracing a kind of genealogy back to this earlier ancestor? And so since Banquo is James's ancestor, right? And James's legitimacy, James is a new king, and his legitimacy remains very much in question. We've just had the gunpowder plot that tried to blow up the kingdom. Queen Elizabeth waited till her deathbed to name her heir, and is not 100% sure that she ever did. And there were lots of competing. James had to imprison his cousin, Arabella Stuart, who had an equal claim to the throne. All of that was happening around the time of Shakespeare's writing Macbeth. So I think the historical materials for this play, without the witches, Shakespeare's introduction of the witches is what's fascinating, were about making James feel more securely positioned as England's king, right? That it's not Macbeth, but it's Banquo, whose children, offspring, were going to rule England. And that's what that's the sort of political work that the play is doing. The fascinating question is, why bring the witches in at all? It's such a strange decision.
This makes complete sense, and I've never really thought about it from that perspective. So thank you for sharing. We have another question about sort of a text, part of the text. So can you talk a little, the cauldron? This person is asking about the cauldron. What is the function of the ingredients in the cauldron? Is Macbeth meant to be corrupted by the steam that's coming off of it, or actually to drink some of the horrific broth? And who would the masters that, sorry, let me read and then process. Who would be the masters that bring the apparitions? Who are they maybe meant to represent?
I haven't reread the Cauldron. I haven't reread the play in the last week or two for this. So I'm having trouble remembering the exact details around the Cauldron. In general, there are many props associated with witches gathering in circles around a cauldron, making their brew, which could poison people. It could, the vapors, as your questioner asked, could cause people to hallucinate, or they could just be trying to get this poisonous substance into someone. It's interesting that Lady Macbeth is also talking about imbibing spirits. So, any of those things that this interesting person asked are possible, but I don't want to spend too much time on it, only because I haven't been deep into the cauldron question, and I don't want, therefore, to just be guessing.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. A couple more questions, and we are almost at time, which I can scarcely believe. This is a question less about the witches and more about Lady Macbeth, who we have talked about in the first of this conversation. In your opinion, do you think that Macbeth would have acted had Lady Macbeth not pushed him to do so?
So there's a famous essay called "How Many Children Hath Lady Macbeth," which gets at it's precisely this kind of thing, that Lady Macbeth has this weird comment about, that she's given suck, and that she'd, smash the brains of a child if she, had the determination that Macbeth had. But the essay is about how much this play makes us treat these people as sort of real people who had a before and an after life, or maybe not afterlife in this case, but have a past, what the backstory is in effect, and that the play encourages that or invites that by giving us these sort of biographical hints. So this is some version of that, which is a fascinating thing to think about. What if Lady Macbeth hadn't intervened? And what's clear is that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have, unfortunately, probably the best marriage in all of Shakespeare, that these guys actually have a sort of partnership. It seems, if I take this question at face value, I'm having a little bit of resistance because there's so many different factors involved. So to answer this question as if, we're in a kind of rational world where these two people are making a decision, strips the whole witchcraft, fate, all the things we've been talking about. But what seems clear is that what really pushes Macbeth over the edge, what really gets him to act, is when Lady Macbeth challenges his masculinity and just keeps pushing about what she would do if she were a man, and how he has too much of his mother's milk in him, and how he's sort of, when she emasculates him and threatens him that way, that's when he's all of a sudden shifts from questioning the ethics of it to thinking about the practical challenges. So it's certainly a folie à deux, like it's the two of them working off each other. And in that sense, I think the question is a really important one, that she is a huge actor in this drama. And Shakespeare goes out of his way to suggest that, if we look at the two couples, as it were, Macbeth and Banquo, and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth discussing what to do, Banquo is in favor of doing nothing, right? And if that's all that Macbeth had. But as soon as he brings this to Lady Macbeth, that's when things get interesting. So she's absolutely crucial in making this happen.
The idea of them having sort of, the most successful marriage in Shakespeare's canon is amazing, but
it's sadly true, but they're sort of a good couple, as it were.
That's absolutely. And again, if you're interested in more of those questions, I would urge you to watch the conversation that we had last year, where I think we had a very robust discussion about the relationship between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth.
Yes.
If you can believe it, we are at 1:57. I do have one final question for you. And this is a question that I like to ask all of the guests who come on Civically Speaking and our other virtual series. And that is not apropos of this discussion necessarily, but if you could go back in time to witness one piece of performance, that could be music, that could be theater, that could be dance, what performance or piece would it be, and why?
Oh my gosh, I feel I should have been warned about this question.
That's why I did. I can go first if you'd like. I can share mine. But
yes, let's hear what yours is.
Well, we talked about masks earlier, and we also talked about Anne Boleyn. But on the death of Cardinal Wolsey, Anne wrote and directed a masque called "Sending the Cardinal to Hell," which was performed for all of court as quite a flagrant, disrespectful act towards him. And I've always just found that petty beyond belief in a way that I find particularly fascinating. So I would love to see that performed.
Wow, that is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. Well, I can't promise that this would be my final answer, but I think I'd probably like to see the first performance of Hamlet.
I love
it's
that.
my
That's
favorite
a great one.
And I would love to, I can't imagine what that must have been like. So, but I have many things I'd like to see, including, the first performance of Macbeth must have been quite extraordinary. And we have no idea, if James was actually there, but to see the reaction of James to this play would have been extraordinary.
It would have been. I'm adding that to my list now. I will credit you with the idea, but okay. We are at the hour. Ramie, thank you so much for such a
thank you, Sarah, for this fascinating conversation.
Oh, this was so much fun. Everyone at home, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you and your support, and we urge you, if you found this conversation fascinating, as I'm sure you did, and would like to learn more about someone else's interpretation of witches, witchcraft, and Lady Macbeth, we do have Macbeth in Stride on our stages starting tomorrow for opening night and running through November 14th. You can get tickets at AmericanRepertoryTheater.org, and the link is in the chat. Thank you all so much. And I just want to echo that there's a lot of things in the Q&A for you. So thanks so much, Ramie. Have a good day, everyone. And we will see you next time on another episode of Civically Speaking.